of the recording.
Um, yeah, we are recording, which is real bad news for Mike Lamazek. He's gonna have to trim the recording.
Okay.
Dan, you were second place at Gen Con.
Yes.
Unfortunately, that is the first you missed the cut to be first place. Yeah, I think your expression tells me all I need to know about it.
No, I mean, it was a good game. I hadn't played Game of Thrones competitively at a big tournament in about a year and a half or 2 years. I think Gen Con was actually the um the most competitive event 2 years prior that I had been to. Went to a couple of smaller regionals, but basically I had a kid in between, and so I wasn't able to stay as actively involved as I normally would. But yeah, so I would say all in all, it actually went a lot better than I would have expected.
Well, I think what the audience would like to know is for someone who hasn't played Game of Thrones in 2.5 years, seriously, or like I think you've commented on decks, you've like been aware a little bit for the last year or so, but what are the steps you took to prepare for Gen Con?
Yeah, good question. I mean, the preparation for a large event is always one of the main areas of focus. I would say I do have an advantage in that I've played Game of Thrones since 2005, and so I have a pretty good understanding of the mechanics. I know things have evolved over time with both um, the mechanics that are designed into the game and also the rules have changed over time with the introduction of first 1.0 and then 2.0. But basically, it's the same game, and so that part works for me. But you're totally right that the being away from the game is just a huge barrier to competing. And I think there are a couple of things. I mean, one is just missing all the muscle memory that you get from playing regularly. And I hadn't been playing regularly. In fact, I don't think I'd played a Game of Thrones game in
Red Saturday?
probably 6 months prior to when I began practicing for Gen Con. So um,
Didn't
it,
you did play Red Saturday though, the premier New York event.
yeah, I think that was the
You
last
played
one. I mean, that was more
2012.
than 6 months before, though.
Yeah,
And
no, it was in November of last year, so closer to like 10 months. But
yeah,
I think
and then I think
you did
in
reasonably well.
yeah, I did. I think I got fifth. No, did I get fifth there? Something like that. No, I'm sorry, I finished 17th there. And then I finished fifth. I think you and I went to the
Oh
Windy
yeah,
City Winter Cup.
yes, you
And I
went to
made,
Chicago on a whim.
yeah, right. And I think that's the one that I dropped to drink with you in the cut.
That's my
Um,
fault. I should have let you spread your wings.
No, I mean, actually, I know we're going off on a bit of an aside, but I think one of the fun things about the community is that it's just the people and the experience. And since I wasn't playing competitively, it was nice because I didn't feel pressured at that tournament to do really well, and I was able to just drop out in a way that I wouldn't have done before. So,
That's
but going into Gen Con, I knew I was going to take it seriously and I was going to go as far as I could. And so needed to get the reps in for sure. The other thing that I did was join a build group, and I've been longtime friends with a lot of players in the community, but especially with those who are part of the Long Lances, and many of those I actually worked with in other previous build groups when I was playing more competitively, and so I think there's nothing like a team or a team approach to preparation that really gets you focused, so that was really helpful too.
Let's dive into that a little bit more. I think one of the things that people that build on their own or like play on Iron Throne, etc., maybe they don't understand the benefits that you get from being part of a build group. Can you talk a little bit more about what specifically you felt your own personal strengths were amplified or your weaknesses were buttressed up by being part of a group?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to approach this question, I think, a little bit differently than how you're thinking. But let me just start off by saying, since I've played for a long time, I've been involved in a lot of different regional groups, in person and communities. I've helped build uh, at least two metas, the DC meta back in 2008, and it's of course evolved significantly since then. But those are back when Corey and Eric and others are playing quite a bit, and then helped build the New York meta. Not the first version, I would say Staglord. Chris,
Oh yeah,
back in the day,
yeah, back
was
like
yeah,
way. That's before I lived here.
yeah, right, yeah. It goes back, but anyway, those are really early days that I played a little bit with him. But then he moved on, and I helped build the New York community, and so I would say. Uh, the biggest benefit for me, frankly, is just the community. I mean, it can be a little bit intimidating, I think, not just for new players, but for longtime players who aren't as plugged into the community to go online and see in the Facebook group or whatever online communities. I mean, there are hundreds of people, most of whom I have no idea who they even are. And so being part of a group of people that's a little bit more intimate and a little bit more social. And we didn't just talk cards. I mean, we talked life and, events and activities and kids and all of that. And so the biggest benefit for me is just getting plugged in with the people again. And that's what I think being part of a build group means for me. But of course, the stated purpose and goals of a build group typically are to win tournaments and focus on Game of Thrones. And so the other what for me tend to be more ancillary benefits, but also are important are to really get focused in a way of testing. I Because testing for any event involves just exploration of so many different potential builds and approaches and strategies. The reality is that with more people, especially good, smart, focused players, you're going to be able to cover more ground more quickly.
So let's actually take a step back in terms of being part of a build group versus not being part of a build group.
Yeah.
I want to dive into some of the things that you spoke about. It's not just about the thrones, it's about the community, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I know maybe here's a tangent. What was your road to Gen Con like? I mean, I know you had a plan going into Gen Con. How did that get derailed? What was the narrative around maybe the reality of Gen Con versus what you felt like going into it? What
So
was the
say
biggest difference?
Sandy as the co-driver in our overnight impromptu driving trip to Gen Con when our flights were canceled. I assume you're not talking about the unexpected road trip, but the preparation in advance,
No,
or
but actually, I was talking about the unexpected road trip. I want to
okay.
ask you about like kind of the mental adjustments you had to make.
Yeah.
You did drive for a significant portion of that, and you know that like maybe the getting there the night before, sleeping well, going into the tournament. I think, well, I would have done better. You already got second. I don't know how much better you could do. Like the ceiling's pretty high for you there, but like I how much did you feel like your environment contributed to your contribution at Gen Con?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's no doubt that rest and feeling good and healthy going into any large competition, whether it's a card tournament or anything else, is a benefit. Um, I would say that while I did not get a lot of sleep, just for those who aren't familiar with our story, we were both flying out of New York, separate airports, in fact, and late
Hell of a
afternoon.
story. It's a hell of a story.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we had booked these flights for months in advance, and then late afternoon, both of our flights happened to be canceled. In fact, mine was canceled first, and as you know, and for the benefit of the listeners, I was calling you, seeing if there was any way that I could get a flight into Chicago to meet you there, so we could drive down from Chicago together. But it turned out that our flights from New York were canceled, and so we had to drive a little further than that. And yeah, I it was just the worst traffic I think I'd seen in New York. But we rented the car and drove through Manhattan, which in retrospect was probably not the optimal route.
We spent 2 hours going like 30 miles, and then the rest of the 500-mile trip took, 8 hours, 10 hours. I don't know.
Yeah, we there was a 2 block stretch that took us an hour when we first started out. I mean, we were watching people walk by just over and over as we were stuck in traffic. But yeah, I mean, then it's near the end of it. I know. So I drove the shortest amount of time, but I did drive the 12:30 to 4:30 a.m.
You drove
leg.
from the middle stretch.
Yeah, and I can tell you that I was going as close to 90 as I could for most of that time. Um, you know, watching for traffic and traffic police. But no, yeah, I mean, so it was a long night. Um, but we got there in time, and luckily we got there early enough that it wasn't a rush to get the deck lists in and
Uh, sorry.
well,
Well, for some of you, it was you went directly, you picked up your badge, you went and turned in your deck list, etc. Some of us decided to, I don't know, check into our hotel, return the car, etc.
fair enough.
Yeah, we had a rush.
Well, for the record, I did in fact have time to do your deck list as well, which was, you know,
Well, I think literally no one watching this stream does not know what my deck list is. It's the same deck list it's been for 6 months.
well, it was new to me because I haven't been playing. I thought it was cool. But anyway, yeah, so we got in on time. I would say though, to your earlier question, definitely the way that you approach just the day makes a big difference. So even though I was very low on rest, going into that day, a couple of days before, I had been getting enough sleep. So, if it had been the third or fourth day in a row, it would have been pretty tough. But just with one night's short amount of sleep, it wasn't too bad. And then actually, I ate pretty healthy throughout that day too. Not saying that it was salads and, you know,
So, like,
juice.
I think it's like people always talk to me about, preparation for the day of. And I'm like, look, I drove overnight with Dan. He got second to Gen Con. I went 2 and 5. Like, there's clearly more to it than just being ready for the day. Or
Yeah.
maybe it's just a fundamental difference in how we prepare for the games.
Yeah, I mean, I think a huge factor though too was just the amount of rest I was able to get in between rounds because of the deck I was playing. Free Folk is a build that I disagree with some of the commentary online that it doesn't require skill, but it does give you a lot of time. I mean, the games are typically decided in 10 or 15 minutes, so it's nice to be able to get that rest in between rounds and really refresh before the next round.
That's a great way of putting it. I will steal that in the future when I win on round one. But I think that I do think that you hit on a very good point, which is that people assume that fast decks require no skill.
Yeah,
And
I don't think that's typically true. I mean, the decks that so fundamentally, I think Game of Thrones is a skill-based game. In fact, one of the big differences that I found or discovered when I was getting back into the game versus a year and a half ago is that it feels more skill-based now than it ever has in 2.0 to me.
so that's a perhaps controversial statement.
Well,
I agree with you. For the record, like I think that the combo deck that I play requires a lot of skill. And if you don't think it requires a lot of skill, I will give you my fucking deck list and I challenge you to go better than 50-50 at any tournament. You will get fucking rocked because you don't know what to do. And and Dan, you and I have played the same deck before at different tournaments. Do you remember when we went to Chicago and like you went 4-1 and I went like 1-4? Like It wasn't quite 1 in 4. It was pretty bad though. With the Tyrell, or sorry, Targ Brotherhood.
Yeah,
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 I think there's a lot to be said for like optimal play, etc. But honestly, I think that most often 1.0 elitists tend to overestimate the impact skill had on 1.0, and they underestimate the impact skill has on 2.0. I think
yeah,
like those of us that played both, and I don't want to speak for you, but I was a mediocre player of both. Like I did top 8 for like a year without missing the cut. Then I also never won anything. But like there are decks that require a lot of skill and will have a skill cap, and you'll win games with them. But they won't actually, they're not autoplay.
yeah,
And that was true in 1.0. That is true in 2.0. If
yeah.
any, oh,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Sorry. Well, I was just going to say that, every deck has its strategy. And so there are certainly optimal ways to play a lot of decks. A couple of comments. I mean, first on your 1.0 versus 2.0 point of view, I mean, I completely agree. In fact, uh, for those who played at the beginning of 1.0, House Lannister dominated for the first 2 years. I mean, it was just oppressive that the advantage that you had from setting up a single Golden Tooth mines or even two Golden Tooth mines, and it was not well balanced. And you talk about variance. I mean, having a single Golden Tooth mines on setup probably which was a House Lannister card location that drew you a card when you revealed a plot or
I mean, yeah, it was. I mean, like most broken cards, it was draw. It was card draw that it gave you.
yeah, and in 1.0, I mean, one of the big differences between 1.0 and 2.0, I think, is that the way that a lot of cards are balanced and sort of the bottleneck for getting ahead in 1.0 had a lot to do with card advantage and card draw. In 2.0, it seems it still card draw is really important, but I would say gold and the ability to marshal large characters tends to drive the pace of the game a little bit more than in 1.0, where 1.0 you could generally, if you built your deck right, afford what you drew. It was just a matter of whether you saw the cards you needed. But in any case, I think that really the difference between 1.0 and 2.0 has less to do with the game itself and more to do with sort of the arc of where the game is in its development and maturation. In 1.0, a lot of the people who talk about it are referring to the last year or two, in which case we had a massive card pool that was very developed, and I think kind of feels like where we are now with 2.0, frankly. And the biggest thing for me that really makes me feel this way about strategy in 2.0 is that plots matter. When I stopped playing, took the pause a year and a half ago, it was basically still, I mean, I think it was kind of builders was the big thing. Maybe we were getting into some other stuff, but actually the Gen Con, my last series Gen Con event before this year was the one that Cancer Lancer won. And I really liked that deck because it wasn't your standard build, but the standard builds all had basically, you know, large gold plots back to back.
I mean, I mean, it was definitely a meta of play big cards and win the game.
Right.
And I
Just
think
play the gold, turn it
Cancer
sideways.
was very much a counter to that.
Yeah, right. Well, so now what's different is that it's actually I didn't see a lot of just back-to-back big gold plots. In fact, people are thinking through the plot selection, and a lot of the plots are predictable, but that was the case in 1.0, and that's where the skill came in, is when you played plots in a slightly different sequence or you played slightly different versions. I like the return to fields plot a lot. I think it adds a lot of
Oh man, I actually have. I will say that this is a good metric for how good the state of the game is. How fucking obnoxious I find it when someone reveals a plot, and like when someone reveals Return of the Fields against my Valar, or when somebody returns, obviously reveals Outwit versus my Valar, or returns whatever stupid plot counters my plot, like the amount of anger I feel is always mitigated by the fact that, look, the game is healthy enough that I can feel this angry about a single decision. And
Right.
that's kind of good.
Yeah, I mean that's the huge difference for me versus a game like Magic the Gathering, for example, where you're just playing what you draw. And not to minimize that too, you were asking about what helps in terms of preparation. I will say I've been playing a fair amount of Arena, Magic the Gathering Arena online. That I think does not really help for preparation for strategy. But to win Magic games and do well, you have to be a tight player and your fundamentals have to be pretty strong. And so, Magic can be especially punishing in that respect, maybe even more so than Thrones because you don't have the plot deck to lean back on when something's going wrong. So, I think, playing other games can help, although really just getting in any sort of game is important. But uh, bottom line on the kind of state of the game, I'm just really happy with where we are on the strategy. There are a few cards that I think are really disruptive to creativity and limit the growth and variety of the
So
competitive scene.
that's
But
actually that leads into my so as a and again, not to rub salt in the wound, as a person who has lost at the highest competitive levels to a deck that most people feel is very boring, what would you change about the meta to make it more exciting? You think there are cards that limit creativity, that limit the expansion of the meta. What what is the let's talk about the top two cards on that list.
so there's kind of a practical way to look at this, and then also kind of a principled way to look at it. I will say, in principle, I personally dislike cards that fundamentally alter the game mechanics. A good example, which I don't think is overpowered in the current metagame, I just don't like it, is a card like Dorn, where for me as I tend to be more, even though I did well with Free Folk, my natural inclination is to play more of a control based or tempo sort of build. And tempo and control really rely on gaining card advantage over several rounds and then ultimately dominating the opponent. And so a card like Dorn really shuts off a strategy like that. And really all you have to do is play it. So I think cards like that are very dangerous to a lesser extent, but still uh, problematic is Flea Bottom, although that's on the restricted list as well. But neither one of those really break the game or disrupt the variety in the same way that Drowned God Fanatic does. And I think that's kind of enemy number one for me. The ability to just cancel any character ability from hand without any cost is,
Well,
or I suppose the cost of losing a card from hand, but go ahead.
no, I was gonna say that is the cost, is that you lose a card from hand. But eventually you can put that card into play. So
Well, the ability to put it back into play, I think, is meaningful and significant, but not ultimately what restricts the growth of new deck types. I think you can't look at any one card in a vacuum, right? So in a vacuum, a card like that might feel balanced or slightly above the power curve. But I think if you look at where certain houses are, it makes it very difficult to play certain houses. I mean, as an example, so I know I played Targaryen technically as my house card, but the real Targ decks, the ones that had Targaryen cards in the main deck, uh, really struggled at Gen Con. And I don't think that that's coincidence or popularity or the love of a faction. Uh, I can tell you that prior to deciding on Free Folk, I spent a lot of time working with House Targaryen, trying to make a Dragon Pit deck work, just trying to build different versions and permutations, and I couldn't get it to work. I could get it to beat Stark, I could get it to beat a lot of the other good decks, but ultimately it couldn't beat Greyjoy, and it wasn't because it couldn't keep up on the big guys, although the big guys in the saves are a problem against Targaryen. And even the location removal, which was a problem, was, you could kind of play around it, but ultimately Targaryen to come out fast enough to beat a lot of those decks has to play cards like Kotho or Aegon or other, Drogon, characters that have really important high impact triggers.
So,
And
oh, sorry. I think Targ is like when you talk about big characters versus high impact characters. Like Danny is, I would not consider Danny a big character, but she is high impact.
maybe, I mean, she certainly is, but in this case, Drowned God Fanatic, I wouldn't say is as tough for her, although it's, it can certainly hurt if you're looking to kill a character, get it down to its last single strength, and then that's canceled. But no, I think cards like Aegon, that add a lot of speed, or Kotho that add a lot of speed, or even something like Missende if you need that extra body, can be a really big deal when you cancel it. So it's just losing that
Well,
tempo early on is, yeah, go ahead.
that is one of the tempo plays. Like I think Targ's tempo plays can be very easily canceled because they're all character based.
Yes.
Are
In,
there? I think other than Plaza of Pride, I can't think of any tempo plays from Targ that are not character based.
well, I mean, depending on what you're killing with the burn,
Oh,
events can be pretty.
that's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but and I'm just using Targaryen as an example, although I think that Targaryen, if what used to be the case in 1.0, and I think at various times is probably true in 2.0 too, is that the metagame is a reflection of not just any one house, but the combination of houses. And so when Targaryen is strong, and when Burn in particular is strong, it does things to the metagame that can be, balancing. So knocking Targaryen out completely with essentially what amounts to a single card has distorting effects on the rest of the environment. And the second card, looking beyond Drowned God Fanatic, I think in this one, maybe a little bit controversial, but it's just my view, is Skagos.
So the big question in my mind is: do you restrict Skagos? Do you restrict the Mira, or is there some other start card that you restrict to make it more in line? I kind of, I mean, yeah, I can say this. It's my fucking podcast. Uh, uh, Skagos is my choice because it is the worst. It enables so many styles of play that would just seem unbalanced fundamentally.
So the
If
problem
Go
the
ahead.
problem with dealing with or addressing a card like Skagos is that it is a card, unlike the Fanatic, that the environment can adjust to. The biggest adjustment I think for me is that it's very difficult to play Martell or many different Martell builds that rely on icon manipulation. I mean, you can certainly play Splash Martell. Noble Lineage is a great card, and even I know that Martell Wars won a tournament or two in Europe, so or did quite well there. So
I want
I'm not saying that Martell isn't competitive per se, but Martell tends to keep Greyjoy in check, or can. Uh,
because they disable their big. Yeah.
right. Yeah. And so, when you have this kind of, this one card that just puts so much pressure on Martell, you're fighting an uphill battle as a Martell player, and it turns a lot of people off. That distorts the meta game, and then you have Greyjoy, run away with it. So anyway, going back to Skagos specifically, I think it's hard because I think a lot of people can look at the results of recent tournaments and say, well, Stark is doing well, but it's not that ahead of the curve. And in a case like this, it's not about whether Skagos is helping Stark win everything, like, arguably Drowned God Fanatic has, but it's more about the variety you don't see because Skagos is around.
So that was kind of my point with a lot of the restricted list, I guess, prior to this conversation, is that it's not so much about what it enables, but what it removes from the meta. Just
Right.
virtue, like by virtue of trade routes being restricted, we have so many decks that aren't viable because they have some other restricted card plus trade routes. And I
Yeah.
don't think people realize, like, look, yeah, we have to restrict trade routes because it's stupid with XYZ, means that you also cut out these other decks from the meta. And like the reverse of that argument is what you're saying with Skagos is like Skagos enables a whole field of stupid shit.
Well, I'm saying both, actually. Yeah, I mean, I think it both, reduces the amount of Martell, which then,
Yeah.
of course, allows Greyjoy to dominate. Um, but it also, you're right. I mean, it paired with other Stark cards can be oppressive on its own. Although I think not quite as bad as Drown God Fanatic. At least that's my opinion.
But Giant Rock Fanatic is already restricted. Like
I think they just need to ban Drown God Fanatic.
that's a strong line for another champ card. I don't think they'll ever ban
Yeah,
it.
I mean, this is a big question. It's I, I'm not. Can you call a card or a discussion like this an existential question? I'm not sure, but I think that there are broad implications for banning cards, and it's a line that FFG has been very reluctant to cross in any edition of Game of Thrones. But I think for me, it's really a question of uh, what drives innovation and variety and creativity and fun.
So, would you say that the game would be more fun if people banned cards?
Oh yeah,
Oh,
definitely.
that's
Yeah,
my quote. That's my quote for the post.
so and I'm as I'm sure you know, Sandy,
Yeah.
I've been a long proponent of a more significant restricted list. In 1.0, I pushed for a sort of lengthy restricted list, which ultimately is the way the FFG went. And I don't want to take credit or anything. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people pushing for it, but I will say that one of the greatest things about the end of 1.0 is that they had a really dynamic and frankly long restricted list that allowed for a lot of custom tailored experiences and changes from season to season. And we seem to be moving that direction in 2.0 as well. And, for those I know not everyone will agree, but I hope that those who were initially a little bit reluctant or concerned about a restricted list have been converted because I think that in 2.0 the restricted list seems to be working quite well too. And in fact, I would argue that we should lengthen it.
Well, I think that in 2.0, I was a big proponent of not having a restricted list. I thought they should just print more cards that were on the same power level so that you'd have to make a decision. So, for example, let's name a random card on the restricted list, and I'll tell you how we should have fixed it without a restricted list.
Well, uh, you know, gosh, I wish I knew the restricted list better. One of the challenges of getting back into it from not being out of it for a while is I don't actually recall all the but
Yeah, no, I mean,
Marine, I mean, I can tell you the tar cards on it probably.
so I think actually let's talk about the tar cards. So like Marine,
Yeah.
Hisdar, yeah. So I know you were a big fan of Target Salt prior to, was it prior to Marine and Hisdar being on there, or was it just right after?
Oh, I did. When I was playing, I was sort of dabbling at the time that Marine was new. I had I had more or less gotten out of the game, but I think I went to a tournament where Marine was unrestricted.
Yeah, so I think that the way you make Marine balanced is you give every faction similar loyal draw, right? So for Targ, it's cards in challenge phase. For Stark, it might be draw, reveal the top three cards of your deck, draw any that are that are stark and non-neutral or whatever, right? Like, I think there's thematic elements of every faction that can be used to, instead of a restricted list, just give everybody the same fucking deal. Like, I'm okay with a high power level game if every deck is broken. And this
So
is kind
I'm going to disagree with you on this one.
yeah.
I mean, yeah, on sort of on two levels. So first, design is tough, and just game design, I mean, and card design, and then testing is even more difficult. With an ever expanding card pool, it's just we're not going to get every card right. I think that's obvious from seeing the cards that are printed. And so trying to ensure that we nail the exact kind of level um, of power for each card in an ever expanding card pool is, I think, just virtually impossible. And the best we can do is target sort of a range, and then, like weeds in a garden, um, pull out or significantly limit those that seem to be problems. And in terms of the idea that, we could give everyone kind of a similar but more thematic thing. I mean, I like the idea of that in principle, but the execute I don't know if it's FFG or the design team or the testing team, but the history and track record of doing this is very poor. I mean, I could
That's
cite
a very diplomatic way of saying, yeah, like great, but it's just gonna be fucked up. Like they're
I
just gonna
mean,
fuck it up.
right. And so here's an example, right? So I'm getting back into the game, and Greyjoy has a limited location that says, if I am first player, I can draw two cards. And Targ says, if I have two attachments. Which one of those things are easier to achieve?
Well, you're talking to the OG combo player here. I can get two attachments way easier than you can win initiative. But no, your point is correct. Like nobody runs two attachments to enable that card, right?
Right.
That
Yeah.
card doesn't make the cut ever. But it's so easy to arbitrarily win an initiative.
Right. And the other houses are kind of similar. I mean, some of them are better than others or more consistent than others. And that's, that's not even addressing the fact that in a house like Greyjoy, card advantage tends to be um, harder to come by. I mean, you have a few good cards that you might lean back on. Cards like Great Kraken or that character that draws you cards when you play locations, but by and large, you're relying on your saves and your ability to win challenges to maintain your board advantage as opposed to just drawing into new cards.
I don't know if you've seen the Alanis that lets you draw a card every time you at Greyjoy location enters play or something.
Yeah, no, I mean, so yeah, there's that, and there's Great Kraken, and really, then after that, it's just the location.
Or Insight.
Or yeah, right. I mean, there's insight, or I suppose Asha probably is a pretty good
Yeah,
source
I
if
mean,
you
like
have.
there's enough draw, and I think you kind of isolated the issue with Greyjoy is that even their weaknesses, they have sufficient cards to
Well,
kind of.
right. So if you give a card like that to Greyjoy, that feels a really important niche, as opposed to, and I've referenced Targ again because I'm familiar with it, and it's traditionally my favorite house. But Targaryen, I mean, you take Marine away, and how are you drawing?
No, but I mean, I think you're to put an equivalent case for Marine. It's basically if you had a location like Marine that was non-unique and said, you know, kneel it to draw two cards.
Or, even if you want to really enhance burn in a way that's not too NPE, that's not like kill everything, what if you just, I mean, in 1.0 they had a card that said, this is a very powerful card. It was a character that cost 3, which is high in 1.0. That would be like a 4, maybe even a 5 gold equivalent. And it was 1 strength. And it said, after a character's strength is reduced to 0, draw a card.
That Brazen Beasts, or no? That was
No, no, no. It was it a crown or something? I forget. You never really
yeah.
won challenges with it. It was just there to draw your cards. But you
Okay.
had, it required some work to do it, and you wouldn't just auto draw multiple cards. You really had to commit to it. You didn't play it in every deck. It wasn't like Marine in that respect.
You don't play Marine in every deck now. I would build decks around Hizar. I would build decks around
Yeah.
Fleet Bottom. I would
Right. Well,
actually
yeah.
build decks around other house cards than Targ.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
Targ's just not in a good place. But and the same thing is true of a lot of houses, maybe not on draw specifically, but just in terms of feeling like you're below the power curve and don't have as many options. I will say though, I mean, I think that if we waved a magic wand and Drowned God Fanatic didn't exist, it was banned or was never printed, I think you'd see a lot more variety. There's a few other cards like that, but Drowned God Fanatic in my mind is the worst.
So, Dan, I have to say, knowing Vince, literally knowing Vince, and having him talk about that card, I think you're right. I think you would probably agree that you're right. I think that it's unfortunate that it's taken such a meta-defining role that canceling character abilities surprisingly is like a huge deal. How would you, if you were in charge of, if you were the designer of Ground God Fanatic, what restrictions or what would you change about it to make it playable but not overpowered?
Yeah, so if we felt like canceling character abilities were an important mechanic in the game, but we didn't want it to feel overpowered, I mean, first, I think it's debatable whether or not we even want to cancel character abilities. Certain houses rely on character abilities more than others, and so any card that does that is going to inherently impact some houses and some play styles and approaches more than others. But let's assume that we want to do that. I don't like the Brotherhood character that does something similar. I think that that's similarly kind of poorly designed. It's basically unplayable in a lot of builds, and then it tends to be either really unimpactful in some games or defining in other games without just being a solid card very often. But if we could find a way to make Drowned God Fanatic uh, a little bit less swingy.
How would you do that though? Like, what are the restrictions or the artificial changes you would make?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of mechanics you can play with, right? As a designer, it requires some creativity. I mean, the first problem with Drowned God Fanatic is that it's played from your hand, so it's a surprise. You can't play around it. Um, so, if that effect instead played from even the dead pile, let's say, that would require you to play it, marshal it, get it killed, that sort of thing. Or if it were something like kill it to cancel an ability while it was in play, that would be just a little bit better.
I,
You could also play with the kind of the limitations on what it can cancel. For example, if it could cancel a non-unique character ability or a character ability of a character that costs less than, let's say, 5 gold or less, that would help. It's really the versatility and surprise factor that makes it overly powerful.
so would you negate, and I'm just talking from a game design perspective, would you negate the versatility of playing it from hand out of surprise? Would you negate, like, what would, like, tell me about your ideal version of the card?
Well, I think if it were common knowledge that somebody had it, that would make a big difference in a lot of matches. But I don't know that that would even go far enough, frankly. I think that just that mechanic on its own is quite powerful and probably needed to be structured a completely different way. I think I would do multiple things to change it, which is why I think that it probably just needs to be banned. It's not a small the problems that I have with that card are not small problems.
Yeah, no, I mean that's why I think this is an interesting question. Is like, what would your version of a balanced version of John God Fanatic look like?
Okay, so just off the top of my head, I'd say you could put a card with the same stats that said something like, if, if Drowned God Fanatic is in your dead pile, um, move it to your discard pile to cancel the triggered ability of a non-unique character.
So you think, all right, I see. So like the
And that would
Sakura,
be a fine card. I mean, maybe you could even make it a little more powerful than it is. Give it an extra strength or something. It's a 3/3 at that. It would still be a very playable card.
that makes sense. Yeah. So I'm gonna use that as the quote. Drown God Fanatic is the worst card in the game.
Actually, I don't think that's overstating it.
Dan, I think it's been 45 minutes. This is way too much content for a shitty podcast. We need more of you. I actually One of the things that I wanted to say is we had a 12-hour drive, 16-hour drive to Gen Con, of which I think we were both awake 8-ish hours of that.
Sounds about right.
It's super bad. Great time. Some of us obviously cope better with that than others based on our representative finishes. We're looking forward to a tournament. We, being the contents of this stream, are looking forward to a tournament where you're well rested and are playing for real rather than driving across half the country at the last minute.
We'll see. Having a 1-year-old at home and a 6-year-old at home, as you know, makes it difficult. But I enjoy seeing everyone and playing, and this is my only hobby, so
We'll
I
see you
love
at
it.
Saturday.
Sorry?
We'll see you at Red Saturday.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, in fact, I think a couple of Canadians are coming down for US Thanksgiving, and we're gonna have the Glazer family down, and you're gonna be at my house.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
So, yeah, so we'll have a great Thanksgiving, and then we'll follow it up with a fun tournament.
By the way, pro money is I would actually put more than 50%. I would give 2-to-1 odds. Somebody from Dan's house the day before winning Red Saturday versus someone that is not from Dan's house. Let's say that's the caliber of player I expect at your place. Like,
It's going to be a good group of players. I mean, I think it'll depend on the preparation. I don't know how much I'll be able to do in terms of playing before then, but it's a good group for sure.
I think you and Naj, Dark Naj, John Andrews have very like complementary skills in that I think that any deck that Naj builds, you can look at for maybe 20 minutes before a tournament, fix to your liking, and go 5-1, 6-0, whatever. Because I think that like the kind of things that you say that you don't have time to do, other people do, and they will hand you like kind of pre-made solutions that you can tweak to get to where you need them to be.
Yeah, I would agree that John and I work really well together, and I really like working with him. He's one of my good friends. And it's funny, we think quite differently about deck building, but in terms of just approaching things from different sides, but we often, I think, come to a very similar conclusion. And so in that respect, it's very complementary. So yeah, he keeps me grounded. I as those who've worked with me in deck building know, I tend to get sort of preoccupied or even a little obsessed with some of the mechanics I like. And I can work on a bad targ deck for long past the time when it's actually productive.
Yeah, the Targ Brotherhood, real bad. Only you can ever win games with it.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, Dave Stroms and I had a similar experience at Gen Con, the last 1.0 Gen Con. I think I was top eight and he went like 3 and 4 or something. So yeah. Anyway. But no, yeah, it's fun. I mean, really the people is what makes it good, and that's why Thanksgiving and Red Saturday is really fun because it's not just about the cards, it's really about the community.
Uh, Great interview. I think I'm in the dark here. Alexa, increase brightness of Sandy's room by 100%.
There you go. I can see you.
Um, so thank you for listening to this episode of Missing the Cut, the like third real content episode I've ever had. Dan, thank you for providing your insight. I think you're like, I like to have, I don't like people that win tournaments. You've come in second to a lot of tournaments. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but like it means that you have sufficiently read the meta and you got unlucky. Like I don't think there's any way that you make it to where you made it in at Gen Con at any other tournament you've been in without knowing what you're gonna face in some level and then getting unlucky in one game. It's fine.
Yeah, and again, at the end of the day, it's you're not going to win them all, or maybe in my case, any of them. But no, I'm happy with how it ended. It was a fun day.
I think that the only way that you don't make the cut in a tournament is if you play a deck that we give you as a troll, like as a look at this deck. It doesn't have.
I can be pretty good at trolling myself with decks that I'm that I
I
have really no business
bring up
bringing.
the Targ Brotherhood deck, which I think had like three good pieces that were all incorporated into the Free Folk deck, and then the rest was just like not great. It
Yeah,
was you had a lot of tricks, but the tricks were to make up for kind of normal things that other decks did.
it sounds like my sort of deck.
Yeah, it was a fun deck to play
Yeah.
to some extent. So again, let me say one more time that you'll be at Red Saturday after Thanksgiving. That if people want to have the celebrity chance to beat you in a tournament, it's to come to Red Saturday. It's pretty unlikely, guys. I don't think I've ever beaten you in a tournament, for example, and we've played like a half dozen to a dozen times, somewhere in there. Between 6 and 12 seems about right. Um, but yeah, thanks again for staying up this late. I know it's midnight now. You gotta go to bed.
Yeah, probably should hit the hay here, but thanks, Sandy. Thanks for having me. I hope I know we didn't end up spending a lot of time talking about the free folk games or anything.
No,
Hopefully
no,
people won't be disappointed
that's
with
to make
that, but
you competitive. We don't want to give people an impression that this podcast is about playing the game in any way. It's all
that's right.
about the meta. It's all about what is the mindset that you use to get to second place. And obviously, you could have won that tournament. You could have won any number of other tournaments because you have the tools to get there. It's all luck after you make the cut. It's all luck.
Yeah, I mean, it's very matchup driven at the cut. So, and there's a luck element. I mean, I think I went into that last game with a plus matchup slightly, but I hit some variance, and I think I will say I'll give Tom credit where it's due. I think he played a tighter game than I did in that final too. The variance I think played a factor, and then his tight gameplay played a factor for sure. So. But Sandy, thanks for having me today, and look
I
forward
want to
to
say one note from my watching your game versus Tom. Do you know the thing that stood out to me the most?
what's that?
There was an incident where I felt like I was not commenting on the appropriate level, and it was when Tom declared a challenge against you. He did not declare stealth with Balon with Great Kraken out, and you did not require him to declare stealth because you knew that it had stealth and he was stealthing someone. Like, I just felt like I was so outclassed by the fact that both of you knew the board state well enough. He was obviously trying to play some mind games in terms of I'm not going to declare stealth on this attack because I want you to forget that Balon has stealth and whatever on the attack back because you had obviously characters with stealth and you were going to try and stealth Balon. And not only did you not fall for it, but you were also like, okay, I'm not even going to try and stealth Balon because I know he has stealth because of Great Kraken. I know you didn't declare stealth on the attack, but I don't want to take that chance, and I'm just going to declare stealth on someone else. And it was a very eye opening for me watching that game. Like, there's a level on which it seemed like, oh, these people they're just not paying attention to the game, and there's another level which they're definitely paying attention, and it's kind of they're trying to induce a mistake. And
Yeah, yeah. I mean, unfortunately, by that point, I think I mean, I was trying to hang in there, but probably it was a 90-10 game for him. So it was, it was his game to lose at that point anyway, and he pulled through. But yeah, you do everything you can, even the little stuff, um, just to make sure that, I mean, anything you can do to, give yourself the edge, maybe even sort of put the opponent on tilt a little bit. I think you try to do. Not in an unsportsmanlike manner, but in terms of really putting early pressure on with the cards and the attacking and that sort of thing. You do all you can to win. So,
I think that is honestly one of the things that I've noticed around the difference between good players and great players is that you're both immune to other people trying that shit on you, and that like you don't do it in a malicious, projective, proactive way. It's just kind of like you just try to induce mistakes, and that's fine. I don't think that's bad. I think that's how you play as a
ultimately, as a game of skill, just to come full circle on this, people should know their decks. And, the difference between somebody who's skilled versus somebody who just grabbed whatever offline and showed up at a tournament because they had the cards. It's knowing how to play your deck under pressure in long days in a variety of matchups that um, require different types of decisions. So, you know, putting people in position where they have to make difficult choices is part of competitive play. And I agree with you. I mean, I think the difference between a solid player and a really excellent player is one in which somebody knows how to put their opponent in difficult choices or force those choices and really put the pressure on, not constantly, but at just the right moments to force an error. So I agree with that.
Um, yeah, I think that for me, well, we got to end this podcast.
Yeah, I think we're rambling at this point, man.
No, but I think that you brought up some great points. We should talk about how making the cut is actually like substantively different from consistently missing the cut, even if you don't win.
Yeah,
Uh,
and the cut games are very different from pre-cut games too. So I agree. Yeah.
yeah, Dan, great talking with you.
You too, Sandy.
Sorry you are on this podcast and not on the winners podcast of like I don't know a real content producer like the White Book or Second Sons or whatever.
That's okay. I'd rather be hanging with you guys, and we'll be doing that soon, eating turkey and, you know, chatting and all kinds of fun stuff at my house. So
Yeah,
looking forward
I'll
to
put it
it.
on my Snapchat story. I'm like 15. Like I have a Snapchat. You don't know.
All right, man.
All right,
Good
take it easy.
talking.
Thanks a lot.